It all started inside a mansion that seemed to have everything money could buy: golden chandeliers, glass walls that opened to endless gardens, and luxury at every corner. But behind those shining walls lived a silence that no wealth could heal. The millionaire's only daughter, once full of life, had been paralyzed after a tragic accident. Since then, the grand house felt more like a prison than a home. She spent most of her days in a wheelchair, looking out the window, watching the world move while her own life stood still. Her father did everything he could to provide comfort: special doctors, private tutors, expensive therapists, but none of it could bring back her smile. In that same house worked a humble maid, a woman whose life was the complete opposite of her employer's. She lived in a small room behind the mansion, working long hours just to put food on the table for her daughter. Her little girl was the complete image of innocence, always humming, always moving, always dancing, even when no music played. She would follow her mother to work sometimes, tiptoeing through the marble halls of the mansion, her eyes wide with curiosity. One afternoon, when the house was unusually quiet, something unexpected happened. The maid's daughter slipped away from her mother's side and found herself near the playroom where the millionaire's daughter sat in silence. What the young girl did next shocked everyone who later heard about it. She began to dance. Her steps were clumsy but full of joy, her little arms spinning in circles as if she were on a stage. At first, the millionaire's paralyzed daughter just stared, her face unreadable. Then, something began to change. For the first time in months, she leaned forward, her eyes lighting up as though a hidden spark had been reignited. But then came the moment no one expected. The millionaire himself walked into the room. His sharp footsteps echoed across the marble floor, and the young maid's daughter froze in fear. She knew she wasn't supposed to be there. The silence felt heavy as he stood at the doorway, his gaze fixed on the strange scene before him: his daughter in her wheelchair, smiling for the first time in ages, and the maid's daughter in mid-dance, trembling, unsure of what punishment would come. What the millionaire did next would stun not just the two girls, but everyone who heard the story later. It was a choice that would change his daughter's life forever, and it was something no one could have predicted. But before anyone could say a word, he took a step forward and, in that moment, the air in the room seemed to stop. The millionaire stood there longer than anyone expected, his expression unreadable. The maid's daughter, small and nervous, looked down at her feet, wishing she could disappear into the polished floor. The paralyzed girl, however, couldn't take her eyes off her father. For weeks, she had watched him drown himself in work, carrying his pain like a shadow, never truly looking at her except when he thought she was asleep. Now he was finally present in this quiet room, staring at something he couldn't quite understand. To the world, he was a man of power. People respected him, envied him, and even feared him in some cases. But within the walls of his mansion, he was just a father who didn't know how to fix the one thing his wealth couldn't repair: his daughter's broken spirit. He had tried everything doctors suggested, paid for the best treatments, and even flew specialists in from abroad. Each attempt ended in the same way, with disappointment and the same silence in his daughter's eyes. That silence had started to feel heavier than any business failure he had ever endured. The maid, unaware of what was unfolding, was in another part of the house finishing her chores. She had told her daughter countless times not to wander, especially near the family's private rooms, but the little girl, with her playful heart, couldn't resist. Something about the millionaire's daughter drew her in. She wasn't afraid of the wheelchair or the silence. To her, the girl sitting by the window wasn't the rich man's daughter. She was simply another child who looked like she needed a friend, and so she danced. She danced the way children do, without thinking, without worrying about perfection. She swayed, she twirled, she laughed softly under her breath. For her, movement was freedom. For the millionaire's daughter, watching that movement was like remembering what freedom once felt like. In that moment, she didn't feel trapped inside her chair. She felt like she was part of something alive again. The millionaire's chest tightened as he realized what he was seeing. It wasn't just a child spinning around. It was his own daughter smiling for the first time in months. A smile so faint yet powerful enough to bring tears to his eyes. But another part of him fought against the emotions rising inside. He was a man who believed in rules, in keeping boundaries clear between his family and his staff. Allowing this little girl to stay here, to influence his daughter in ways even experts had failed to do, went against everything he thought he stood for. The room held its breath as he finally moved closer, each step slow and deliberate. The maid's daughter trembled, unsure if she should run or stay frozen. His daughter looked between them both, her hands gripping the sides of her wheelchair. No one spoke, but each heart in that room beat with the same unspoken question: what would he do next? The millionaire stopped just a few steps away from the two girls, his tall frame casting a shadow across the floor. The maid's daughter could barely breathe, her small hands clutched tightly at her dress. She expected anger, maybe even harsh words, because she knew she didn't belong there. But instead of speaking, the millionaire's eyes rested on his daughter. Her cheeks, once pale and lifeless, now held a faint color. Her lips curved into the smallest smile, and her eyes shone with a light he hadn't seen since before the accident. That sight alone shook him more than any business deal or boardroom challenge ever could. but his thoughts were torn. On one hand, something inside told him not to break this moment, to let it unfold, because it was working in a way all his efforts hadn't. On the other, his pride and principles reminded him of the rules he lived by. He had built his empire on discipline, control, and clear lines. Allowing a maid's daughter to step freely into his family's private space challenged everything he believed about status and order. He couldn't ignore the weight of that conflict. Meanwhile, the paralyzed girl's heart raced. She had grown used to silence, used to seeing her father walk past her with only brief words. Now, with the little dancer by her side, she felt alive again, as if the walls of her prison were starting to crack. She wanted to say something, to beg her father not to take this fragile happiness away, but her voice caught in her throat. Only gripped the armrest of her chair tighter, hoping her father would see what she couldn't put into words. Far away in the kitchen, the maid wiped her hands on her apron, humming softly, unaware of the storm quietly brewing upstairs. She had sacrificed everything to work in this house, her dignity, her energy, her time, because she believed it would give her daughter a chance at a better life. But she had no idea her child had crossed into a space that might put everything at risk. The millionaire's mind swirled with more than just the scene before him. Memories of his late wife flickered through his thoughts. She had always believed in kindness, in looking past status and wealth, reminding him often that people's hearts mattered more than their titles. For years, he had buried that softer side, replacing it with power and control. Yet here he was, watching a simple child achieve what his fortune could not, reaching the soul of his broken daughter. He clenched his jaw, unsure if this was a moment to protect or a mistake to correct. The air felt heavier with every second, and both girls waited, silent, for the choice only he could make. But instead of deciding, he turned slowly toward the door, leaving behind a silence deeper than before, one filled with questions that no one dared to voice. The door clicked shut behind him, but the weight of his silence lingered in the room. The maid's daughter stood frozen, her small chest rising and falling as if she had just run a mile. She glanced at the millionaire's daughter, who still wore that faint smile, though now it trembled with uncertainty. The moment that had felt like magic suddenly felt fragile, as though it could shatter at any second. In the halls beyond, the millionaire walked slowly, his footsteps echoing through the emptiness. His mind was at war. The image of his daughter's smile replayed over and over, tugging at something deep within him. Yet every instinct of discipline and control told him he couldn't allow chaos to enter his carefully built world. To the outside world, he was a man of answers. But tonight, he carried only questions. Heavier than the marble walls around him, the maid eventually discovered her daughter missing and hurried toward the quiet wing of the house. When she opened the door and saw her child standing near the wheelchair, her heart sank. Fear gripped her, not of her employer's rules alone, but of losing the only chance she had to keep her job. She rushed forward, pulling the little girl close, whispering sharply about boundaries and respect. Yet when she turned and saw the faint glow in the millionaire's daughter's eyes, she faltered. It had been so long since she had seen life. In that child's face for a moment, the room was silent again, until the paralyzed girl finally spoke, in a voice soft but clear. "She makes me feel happy." Those words pierced through the maid's heart. It was the first time she had heard the girl speak in weeks, but what would the hope, or his rebellion against his rules? As the night deepened, tension in the mansion grew heavier. The millionaire didn't eat. He didn't take his usual phone calls. Instead, he stood alone in his study, staring at old photographs of his wife holding their daughter before the accident. Her laughter in those photos echoed in his mind, clashing with the silence of the house now. In another corner of the mansion, the maid tucked her daughter into the small cot they shared in the servants' quarters, warning her never to dance in that room again. But even as she scolded her, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that her daughter had unlocked something no one else could. By morning, the household felt tense. The millionaire's daughter wheeled herself to the edge of the hallway, eyes searching for the little dancer, longing for that spark of joy again. The maid, torn between fear and her child's innocence, avoided the family wing. And the millionaire, distant yet restless, knew he could no longer ignore the choice looming before him. Every gaze, every unspoken word, pointed toward an inevitable confrontation, one that would change all their lives when it finally broke. The next morning unfolded with an uneasy stillness, as if the walls of the mansion themselves were waiting for something to happen. The maid kept her daughter close, determined to avoid another mistake. But the little girl's restless spirit couldn't be contained. She kept asking about the millionaire's daughter, wondering if she was still sad, wondering if she would ever get to dance for her again. The maid shushed her, fearing that even a whisper might carry through the halls and reach the wrong ears. But what neither of them knew was that the millionaire's daughter had wheeled herself quietly toward the servants' quarters. It was something she had never done before. She stopped just outside the small door, listening to the faint sound of the maid humming, while her daughter tried to mimic the melody with her soft voice. For a girl who had been trapped in silence and loneliness for so long, that sound was like a rope pulling her out of the shadows. She wanted to push open the door, to ask the little girl to dance again, but fear kept her still. Her father's silence the night before weighed on her heavily. Would he even allow it? Just then, The sound of firm footsteps broke the quiet. The millionaire himself appeared in the corridor, his sharp eyes narrowing as he noticed his daughter, lingering outside the servants' quarters. His voice was low but carried an edge. "What are you doing here?" She froze, unable to answer. The maid quickly stepped out, startled to see her employer so close, and lowered her head respectfully. Her daughter peeked out from behind her, clutching her mother's apron. The millionaire's gaze shifted between them, all the maids, her child, and his own daughter. The tension thickened as he realized the lines he had drawn between his world and theirs were beginning to blur. And then came the twist that neither the maid nor her daughter could have predicted. He asked, in a tone almost commanding, "Show me, dance." The maid's heart stopped. She wasn't sure if it was a test, a trap, or something else entirely. The little girl looked up at him, confused but eager, while his daughter's eyes widened with hope. Slowly, nervously, the maid's daughter stepped forward and began to move. Her small feet tapped against the cold floor, her arms twirling, her laughter spilling softly into the tense air. But the millionaire's expression gave nothing away. He watched in silence, his face unreadable, while his daughter leaned forward. In her chair, drawn once again to the light the little girl carried. The dance continued, fragile and uncertain. While everyone wondered the same thing, was this the beginning of a miracle, or the moment everything would collapse? The maid's daughter spun in the middle of the hallway, her laughter echoing off the marble walls, while the millionaire stood unmoving, his face unreadable. Every second felt stretched, every breath in the corridor heavy with anticipation. The paralyzed girl watched with wide eyes, leaning forward in her wheelchair as though trying to step into the rhythm herself. Then, suddenly, something extraordinary happened. For the first time since the accident, her hands began to twitch. Slowly, almost painfully, her fingers lifted, trying to mirror the little dancer's movements. The maid gasped and covered her. Mouth tears welled in her eyes as she realized what she was seeing. The millionaire's stoic mask cracked, his eyes widening in disbelief. His daughter wasn't just smiling, she was fighting her way back to motion. It was small, fragile, but it was real. No doctor had been able to achieve this. No therapy session had sparked such a response. And yet, here it was, brought to life by a maid's child dancing in the hallway. The paralyzed girl laughed, a soft sound that felt like music. "I can feel it," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. The millionaire stepped forward, his chest tight, his pride crumbling in the face of something greater than himself. He knelt beside his daughter, holding her trembling hand, unable to stop the tears that slipped down his face. For the first time, he wasn't the powerful businessman or the master of the mansion. He was simply a father grateful for a miracle, turning his gaze toward the maid and her daughter. His voice shook. "You've done what no one else could." The maid lowered her head, expecting scolding or dismissal, but instead, she heard words she never imagined. "From this day on, you're not just staff, you're family." The little girl beamed, clapping her hands, while the millionaire's daughter reached out toward her, as if asking her to stay by her side forever. The mansion, once filled with silence, now pulsed with new life, laughter, spilling into every corner. The barriers between wealth and poverty, employer and servant, seemed to dissolve in that single moment. But just as relief washed over them all, the unexpected twist came. The millionaire's phone buzzed in his pocket, a call from the overseas doctor who had been working tirelessly on a breakthrough treatment. His voice on the other end was urgent. "We've discovered something critical. Her recovery won't just depend on medicine, but on emotional triggers. If she loses this joy, she could lose her progress." The millionaire froze, realization striking hard. The dance wasn't just a spark, it was the key. And now, more than ever, he knew the future of his daughter's healing rested in the hands of the very child he once thought didn't belong in his world. The story of the mansion had changed forever, but the true test of keeping that fragile happiness alive had only just begun. The call ended, but its message lingered in the millionaire's mind. He looked at his daughter's glowing face, then, at the maid's little girl still catching her breath after the dance. It was clear now the laughter, the joy, the spark she brought into this house wasn't just a moment of happiness, it was medicine of its own kind. And for the first time in his life, the millionaire realized that the most valuable thing he could ever give his daughter wasn't wealth or status, was love, connection, and the freedom to feel alive again. From that day, the mansion slowly changed. The maid's daughter was no longer just a visitor in hidden corners. She became a daily presence in the paralyzed girl's life. They spent afternoons together, playing games, singing songs, and most importantly, dancing. At first, the millionaire's daughter could only move her fingers, but with every shared laugh, every moment of joy, her strength grew. Soon her arms began to lift, then her shoulders, and the faintest trace of movement returned to her legs. Each step was small, but each one felt like a miracle. The maid, once fearful of losing her job, now worked with a lighter heart. She no longer felt like just an employee, but part of something greater. Her daughter had become a bridge between two worlds, between despair and hope, between silence and laughter. And while the millionaire could never erase the pain of the past, he found a new purpose in protecting the joy his daughter had rediscovered. Neighbors who once spoke of the mansion as a place of wealth, but sadness began to notice the change. Music drifted out of its windows, children's laughter echoed through its gardens, and the once lonely halls were filled with warmth. The millionaire, who had built his reputation on power, was now spoken of in a different way. People admired him, not for his fortune, but for the humility and gratitude he showed after his life was touched by something so simple yet so powerful. In the quiet of one evening, as the sun set behind the mansion, the millionaire stood watching. His daughter, she was still in her wheelchair, but she held both arms high, copying the maid's daughter as she spun across the room. Their laughter blended into the fading light, and for the first time, he felt that his home was complete again. The story of a millionaire, his paralyzed daughter, and a maid's child became a reminder that healing doesn't always come in the ways we expect. Sometimes it comes through the smallest hands, the simplest dances, and the purest joy. And in the end, it wasn't wealth that saved his daughter. It was love, friendship, and the courage to let light in where darkness once lived.